the early life of Adolf Hitler. The year his father retired from the customs service at the age of 58, the 6-year-old Adolf entered the public school in the village of Fischeln, a short distance southwest of Linz. This was in 1895. For the next 4 or 5 years, the restless old pensioner moved from one village to another in the vicinity of Linz. By the time the son was 15, he could remember 7 changes of addresses and 5 different schools. For 2 years, he attended classes at the Benedictine monastery at Lambach, near which his father had purchased a farm. There he sang in the choir, took singing lessons, and, according to his own account, dreamed of one day taking holy orders. Finally, the retired customs official settled down for good in the village of Leonding, on the southern outskirts of Linz, where the family occupied a modest house and garden. At the age of 11, Adolf was sent to the high school at Linz. This represented a financial sacrifice for the father and indicated an ambition that the son should follow in his father's footsteps and become a civil servant. That, however, was the last thing the youth would dream of. Then barely 11 years old, Hitler later recounted, "I was forced into opposition to my father for the first time. I did not want to become a civil servant." The story of the bitter, unrelenting struggle of the boy, not yet in his teens, against a hardened and, as he said, domineering father, is one of the few biographical items which Hitler sets down in great detail, and with apparent sincerity and truth, in Mein Kampf. The conflict aroused the first manifestation of that fierce, unbending will which later would carry him so far despite seemingly insuperable obstacles and handicaps, and which, confounding all those who stood in his way, was to put an indelible stamp on Germany and Europe. I did not want to become a civil servant, no, and again no. All attempts on my father's part to inspire me with love or pleasure in this profession by stories from his own life accomplished the exact opposite. I grew sick to my stomach at the thought of sitting in an office deprived of my liberty, ceasing to be master of my own time, and being compelled to force the content of my whole life into paper forms that had to be filled out. One day it became clear to me that I would become a painter, an artist. My father was struck speechless. "Painter? Artist?" He doubted my sanity, or perhaps he thought he had heard wrong or misunderstood me. But when he was clear on the subject, and particularly after he felt the seriousness of my intention, he opposed it with all the determination of his nature. "Artist? No, never, as long as I live." My father would never depart from his never, and I intensified my nevertheless. One consequence of this encounter, Hitler later explained, was that he stopped studying in school. I thought that once my father saw how little progress I was making at high school, he would let me devote myself to my dream, whether he liked it or not. This, written 34 years later, may be partly an excuse for his failure at school. His marks in grade school had been uniformly good, but at the Linz High School they were so poor that in the end, without obtaining the customary certificate, he was forced to transfer to the State High School at Steyr, some distance from Linz. He remained there but a short time and left before graduating. Hitler's scholastic failure rankled in him in later life, when he helped ridicule on the academic gentry, their degrees and diplomas and their pedagogical airs. Even in the last 3 or 4 years of his life, at Supreme Army Headquarters, where he allowed himself to be overwhelmed with details of military strategy, tactics, and command, he would take an evening off to reminisce with his old party cronies on the stupidity of the teachers he had had in his youth. Some of these meanderings of this mad genius, now the supreme warlord personally directing his vast armies from the Volga to the English Channel, have been preserved. Here's the quote. "When I think of the men who were my teachers, I realize that most of them were slightly mad. The men who could be regarded as good teachers were exceptional. It's tragic to think that such people have the power to bar a young man's way." March 3rd, 1942. "I have the most unpleasant recollection of the teachers who taught me. Their external appearance exuded uncleanliness. Their collars were unkempt. They were the product of a proletariat denuded of all personal independence of thought, distinguished by unparalleled ignorance, and most admirably fitted to become the pillars of an effete system of government, which, thank God, is now a thing of the past." April 12, 1942. "When I recall my teachers at school, I realize that half of them were abnormal. We pupils of old Austria were brought up to respect old people and women, but on our professors we had no mercy. They were our natural enemies. The majority of them were somewhat mentally deranged, and quite a few ended their days as honest-to-God lunatics. I was, in particular, bad odor with the teachers. I showed not the slightest aptitude for foreign languages, though I might have had, not the teacher being a congenital idiot. I could not bear the sight of him." August 29th, 1942. "Our teachers were absolute tyrants. They had no sympathy with youth. Their one subject was to stuff our brains and turn us into irredentate apes like themselves. If any pupil showed the slightest trace of originality, they persecuted him relentlessly, and the only model pupils whom I have ever got to know have all been failures in afterlife." September 7th, 1942. To his dying day, it is obvious Hitler never forgave his teachers for the poor marks they had given him, nor could he forget. But he could distort to a point of grotesqueness. The impression he made on his teachers, recollected after he became the world figure, has been briefly recorded. One of the few instructors Hitler seems to have liked was Professor Theodor Giesinger, who strove to teach him science. Giesinger later recalled, "As far as I was concerned, Hitler left neither a favorable nor an unfavorable impression in Linz. He was by no means a leader of the class. He was slender and erect, his face pallid and very thin, almost like that of a consumptive, his gaze unusually open, his eyes brilliant. Professor Edward Humer, apparently the congenital idiot mentioned by Hitler above, for he taught French, came to Munich in 1923 to testify for his former pupil, who was then being tried for treason as the result of the beer hall putsch. Though he lauded Hitler's aims and said that he wished from the bottom of his heart to see him fulfill his ideals, he gave the following thumbnail portrait of the young high school student. Hitler was certainly gifted, although only for particular subjects, but he lacked self-control, and to say the least, he was considered argumentative, autocratic, self-opinionated, and bad-tempered, and unable to submit to school discipline. Nor was he industrious. Otherwise, he would have achieved much better results, gifted as he was. There was one teacher at the Linz High School who exercised a strong, and as it turned out, a fateful influence on the young Adolf Hitler. This was a history teacher, Dr. Leopold Pochtz, who came from the southern German language border region where it meets that of the South Slavs, and whose experience with the racial struggle there had made him a fanatical German nationalist. Before coming to Linz, he had taught at Marburg, which later, when the area was transferred to Yugoslavia after the First World War, became Maribor. Though Dr. Poetz had given his pupil marks of only fair in history, he was the only one of Hitler's teachers to receive a warm tribute in Mein Kampf. Hitler readily admitted his debt to this man. It was perhaps decisive for my whole later life that good fortune gave me a history teacher who understood, as few others did, this principle of retaining the essential and forgetting the non-essential. In my teacher, Dr. Leopold Poetz of the high school in Linz, this requirement was fulfilled in a truly ideal manner. An old gentleman, kind but at the same time firm, he was able not only to hold our attention by his dazzling eloquence, but to carry us away with him. Even today, I think back with genuine emotion on this gray-haired man who, by the fire of his words, sometimes made us forget the present, who, as if by magic, transported us into times past and out of the millennium mist of time, transformed dry historical facts into vivid reality. There we sat, often aflame with enthusiasm, sometimes even moved to tears. He used our budding national fanaticism as a means of educating us, frequently appealing to our sense of national honor. This teacher made history my favorite subject, and indeed, though he had no such intention, it was then that I became a young revolutionary. Some 35 years later, in 1938, while touring Austria in triumph after he had forced its annexation to the Third Reich, Chancellor Hitler stopped off at Klagenfurt to see his old teacher, then in retirement. He was delighted to find that the old gentleman had been a member of the underground Nazi SS, which had been outlawed during Austria's independence. He conversed with him alone for an hour, and later confided to members of his party, "You cannot imagine how much I owe to that old man." Alois Hitler died of a lung hemorrhage on January 3, 1903, at the age of 65. He was stricken while taking a morning walk and died a few moments later in a nearby inn in the arms of a neighbor. When his 13-year-old son saw the body of his father, he broke down and wept. His mother, who was then 42, moved to a modest apartment in Erfaher, a suburb of Linz, where she tried to keep herself and her 2 surviving children, Adolf and Paula, on the meager savings and pension left her. She felt obligated, as Hitler remarks in Mein Kampf, to continue his education in accordance with his father's wishes. In other words, as he puts it, to have me study for the civil servant's career. But though the young widow was indulgent to her son, and he seems to have loved her dearly, he was more than ever determined, absolutely, he says, not to undertake this career. And so, despite a tender love between mother and son, there was friction, and Adolf continued to neglect his studies. Then suddenly, an illness came to my help, and in a few weeks decided my future and the eternal domestic quarrel. The lung ailment which Hitler suffered as he was nearing 16 necessitated his The lung ailment which Hitler suffered as he was nearing 16 necessitated his dropping out of school for at least a year. He was sent for a time to the family village of Spital, where he recuperated at the home of his mother's sister, Teresa Schmidt, a peasant woman. On his recovery, he returned briefly to the state high school at Steyr. His last report, dated September 16, 1905, shows marks of adequate in German, chemistry, physics, geometry, and geometrical drawing. In geography and history, he was satisfactory. In freehand drawing, excellent. He felt so excited at the prospect of leaving school for good that for the first and last time in his life he got drunk. As he remembered it, in later years he was picked up at dawn, lying on a country road outside of Steyr, by a milkmaid and helped back to town, swearing he would never do it again. Footnote. He told this story on himself in one of his reminiscing moods on the evening of January 8th or 9th, 1942, at Supreme Headquarters, Hitler's Secret Conversations, page 160. In the end of footnote. In this matter, at least, he was as good as his word, for he became a teetotaler, a non-smoker, and a vegetarian to boot, at first out of necessity, as a penniless vagabond in Vienna and Munich, and later out of conviction. The next 2 or 3 years Hitler often described as the happiest days of his life. Footnote. These were the happiest days of my life, and seemed to me almost a dream. Mein Kampf, page 18. In a letter dated August 4, 1933, 6 months after he became Chancellor, Hitler wrote his boyhood friend, August Kubizek, "I should be very glad to receive once more with you those memories of the best years of my life." Kiesebeck, The Young Hitler I Knew, page 273. End of footnote. While his mother suggested, and other relatives urged, that he go to work and learn a trade, he contented himself with dreaming of his future as an artist, and with idling away the pleasant days along the Danube. He never forgot the downy softness of those years from 16 to 19, when, as a mother's darling, he enjoyed the hollowness of a comfortable life. Though the ailing widow found it difficult to make ends meet on her meager income, young Adolf declined to help out by getting a job. The idea of earning even his own living by any kind of regular employment was repulsive to him, and was to remain so throughout his life. What apparently made those last years of approaching manhood so happy for Hitler was the freedom from having to work, which gave him the freedom to brood, to dream, to spend his days roaming the city streets or the countryside, declaiming to his companion what was wrong with the world and how to right it, and his evenings curled up with a book or standing in the rear of the opera house in Linz or Vienna, listening enraptured to the mystic pagan works of Richard Wagner. A boyhood friend later remembered him as a pale, sickly, lanky youth who, though usually shy and reticent, was capable of sudden bursts of hysterical anger against those who disagreed with him. For 4 years he fancied himself deeply in love with a handsome blonde maiden named Stephanie, and though he often gazed at her longingly as she strolled up and down the Landstrasse in Linz with her mother, he never made the slightest effort to meet her, preferring to keep her, like so many other objects, in the shadowy world of his soaring fantasies. Indeed, in the countless love poems which he wrote to her, but never sent, one of them was entitled Hymn to the Beloved, and which he insisted on reading to his patient young friend, August Kubizek. Footnote. Kubizek, who appears to have been the only friend Hitler ever had in his youth, has given in his book, The Young Hitler I Knew, an interesting picture of his companion. In the last 4 years before, at the age of 19, he skidded down to the life of a vagabond in Vienna, a portrait, incidentally, that not only fills a biographical gap in the life of the German Führer, but corrects somewhat the hitherto prevalent impressions of his early character. Kubizek was as unlike Hitler as can be imagined. He had a happy home in Linz, learned his father's trade as an upholsterer, worked diligently at it while studying music, was graduated with honors from the Vienna Conservatory of Music, and began a promising professional career as a conductor and composer, which was shattered by the First World War. End of footnote. She became a damsel out of Die Walkyrie, clad in a dark blue flowing velvet gown, riding a white steed over the flowering meadows. Although Hitler was determined to become an artist, preferably a painter or at least an architect, he was already obsessed with politics at the age of 16. By then, he had developed a violent hatred for the Habsburg monarchy and all the non-German races in the multinational Austro-Hungarian Empire, over which it ruled, and an equally violent love for everything German. At 16, he had become what he was to remain till his dying breath, a fanatical German nationalist. He appears to have had little of the carefree spirit of youth, despite all the loafing. The world's problems weighted down on him, Kubizek later recalled. He saw everywhere only obstacles and hostility. He was always up against something, and at odds with the world. I never saw him take anything lightly. It was at this period that the young man who could not stand school became a voracious reader, subscribing to the library of adult education in Linz and joining the Museum Society, whose books he borrowed in large numbers. His young friend remembered him as always surrounded by books, of which his favorites were works on German history and German mythology. Since Linz was a provincial town, it was not long before Vienna, the glittering Baroque capital of the empire, began to beckon a youth of such ambition and imagination. In 1906, just after his 17th birthday, Hitler set out with funds provided by his mother and other relations to spend 2 months in the great metropolis, though it was later to become the scene of his bitterest years, when at times he literally lived in the gutter. Vienna, on this first visit, enthralled him. He roamed the streets for days, filled with excitement at the sight of the imposing buildings along the ring, and in a continual state of ecstasy at what he saw in the museums, the opera house, and theaters. He also inquired about entering the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts, and a year later, in October 1907, he was back in the capital to take the entrance examination as the first practical step in fulfilling his dream of becoming a painter. He was 18 and full of high hopes, but they were dashed. An entry in the Academy's classification list tells the story. The following took the test with insufficient results, or were not admitted: Adolf Hitler, Brunau, A. in April 20th, 1889, German Catholic. Father civil servant, 4 classes in high school. Few heads. Test drawing unsatisfactory. Hitler tried again the following year, and this time his drawings were so poor that he was not admitted to the test. For the ambitious young man this was, as he later wrote, a bolt from the blue. He had been absolutely convinced that he would be successful. According to his own account in Mein Kampf, Hitler requested an explanation from the rector of the academy. That gentleman assured me that the drawings I had submitted incontrovertibly showed my unfitness for painting, and that my ability obviously lay in the field of architecture. For me, he said, the Academy's school of painting was out of the question. The place for me was at the School of Architecture. The young Adolf was inclined to agree, but quickly realized, to his sorrow, that his failure to graduate from high school might well block his entry into the architectural school. In the meantime, his mother was dying of cancer. of the breast and he returned to Linz. Since Adolf's departure from school, Clara Hitler and her relatives had supported the young man for 3 years, and they could see nothing to show for it. On December 21st, 1908, as the town began to assume its festive Christmas garb, Adolf Hitler's mother died, and 2 days later she was buried at Leonding beside her husband. To the 19-year-old youth, it was a dreadful blow. I had honored my father, but my mother I had loved. Her death put a sudden end to all my high-flown plans. Poverty and hard reality compelled me to take a quick decision. I was faced with the problem of somehow making my own living. Somehow? He had no trade. He had always disdained manual labor. He had never tried to earn a cent, but he was undaunted. Bidding his relatives farewell, he declared that he would never return until he had made good. With a suitcase full of clothes and underwear in my hand, and an indomitable will in my heart, I set out for Vienna. I, too, hoped to wrest from fate what my father had accomplished 50 years before. I, too, hoped to become something, but in no case a civil servant. The saddest period of my life. The next 4 years, between 1909 and 1913, turned out to be a time of utter misery and destitution for the conquering young man from Linz. In these last fleeting years, before the fall of the Habsburgs and the end of the city as the capital of an empire of 52 million people in the heart of Europe, Vienna had a gaiety and charm that were unique among the capitals of the world. Not only in its architecture, its sculpture, its music, but in the light-hearted, pleasure-loving, cultivated spirit of its people. It breathed an atmosphere of the Baroque and the Rococo that no other city of the West knew. Set along the blue Danube between the wooded hills of the Wienerwald, which were studded with yellow-green vineyards, it was a place of natural beauty that captivated the visitor and made the Viennese believe that Providence had been especially kind to them. Music filled the air, the towering music of gifted native sons, the greatest Europe had known. Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, and Schubert, and, in the last Indian summer years, the gay, haunting waltzes of Vienna's own beloved Johann Strauss. To a people so blessed and so imprinted with the Baroque style of living, life itself was something of a dream, and the good folks of the city passed the pleasant days and nights of their lives waltzing and whining, in light talk, in the congenial coffee-houses, listening to music, and viewing the make-believe of theatre and opera and operetta, in flirting and making love, abandoning a large part of their lives to pleasure and to dreams. To be sure, an empire had to be governed, an army and navy manned, communications maintained, business transacted, and labor done, but few in Vienna worked overtime, or even full-time, at such things. There was a seamy side, of course. This city, like all others, had its poor, ill-fed, ill-clothed, and living in hovels. but as the greatest industrial center in Central Europe, as well as the capital of the empire, Vienna was prosperous, and this prosperity spread among the people and sifted down. The great mass of the lower middle class controlled the city politically. Labor was organizing not only trade unions, but a powerful political party of its own, the Social Democrats. There was a ferment in the life of the city, now grown to a population of 2 million. Democracy was forcing out the ancient autocracy of the Habsburgs. Education and culture were opening up to the masses, so that by the time Hitler came to Vienna in 1909, there was opportunity for a penniless young man either to get a higher education or to earn a fairly decent living. And as one of the million wage earners, to live under the civilizing spell which the capitalist cast over its inhabitants, was not his only friend. Kubizek, as poor and as obscure as himself, already making a name for himself in the Academy of Music. But the young Adolf did not pursue his ambition to enter the School of Architecture. It was still open for him despite his lack of a high school diploma. Young men who showed special talent were admitted without such a certificate, but so far as it is known, he made no application. Nor was he interested in learning a trade or in taking any kind of regular employment. Instead, he preferred to putter about at odd jobs, shoveling snow, beating carpets, carrying bags outside the West Railroad station, occasionally for a few days working as a building laborer. In November 1909, less than a year after he arrived in Vienna, to forestall fate, he was forced to abandon a furnished room in the Simon Denk Gasse, and for the next 4 years he lived in flop houses or in the almost equally miserable quarters of the men's hostels at 27 Meldementstrasse in the 20th district of Vienna. Near the Danube, staving off hunger by frequenting the charity soup kitchens of the city. No wonder that nearly 2 decades later he could write, "To me, Vienna, the city which to so many is the epitome of innocent pleasure, a festive playground for merrymakers, represents, I am sorry to say, merely the living memory of the saddest period of my life. Even today, this city can arouse in me nothing but dismal thoughts. For me, the name of this fatal city represents 5 years of hardship and misery, 5 years in which I was forced to earn a living, first as a day laborer, then as a small painter, a truly meagre living, which never sufficed to appease even my daily hunger." Always, he says of these times, there was hunger. Hunger was then my faithful bodyguard. He never left me for a moment and partook of all I had. My life was a continual struggle with this pitiless friend. It never, however, drove him to the extremity of trying to find a regular job. As he makes clear in Mein Kampf, he had had the petty bourgeoisie's gnawing fear of sliding back into the ranks of the proletariat, of the manual laborer, a fear he was later to exploit in building up a National Socialist Party on the broad foundation of the hitherto leaderless, ill-paid, neglected, white-collar class, whose millions nourished the illusion that they were at least socially better off than the workers. Although Hitler says he eked out at least part of a living as a small painter, he gives no details of this work in his autobiography, except to remark that in the years 1909 and 1910, he had so far improved his position that he no longer had to work as a common laborer. By this time, he says, I was working independently as a small draftsman and painter of watercolors. This is somewhat misleading, as it is so much else of the biographical nature in Mein Kampf. Though the evidence of those who knew him at the time appears to be scarcely more trustworthy, enough of it has been pieced together to give a picture that is probably more accurate and certainly more complete. Footnote: See Das Ende des Hitler-Mythos by Joseph Gruner, who was personally acquainted with Hitler during part of his Vienna days. See also Hitler the Pawn by Rudolf Olden. Olden's book includes statements from Reinhold Hanisch, a Sudeten tramp who for a time was a roommate of Hitler's in the men's hostel, and who hawked some of his paintings. Conrad Hayden, in Der Führer, always quotes material from Hanisch, including the court records of the lawsuit which Hitler brought against the tramp for cheating him out of a share of a painting which Hanisch allegedly sold for him. End of footnote. That Adolf Hitler was never a house painter, as his political opponents taunted him with having been, is fairly certain. At least there is no evidence that he ever followed such a trade. What he did was draw or paint crude little pictures of Vienna, usually of some well-known landmark, such as St. Stephen's Cathedral, the Opera House, the Burgtheater, the Palace of Schönbrunn, or the Roman ruins at Schönbrunn Park. According to his acquaintances, he copied them from older works. Apparently, he could not draw from nature. They are rather stilted and lifeless, like a beginning architect's rough and careless sketches, and the human figures he sometimes added are so bad as to remind one of a comic strip. I find a note of my own made once after going through a portfolio of Hitler's original sketches. Few faces, crude, one almost ghoulish face. To Haydn, they stand like tiny stuffed sacks outside the high solemn places. Probably hundreds of these pitiful pieces were sold by Hitler to the petty traders to ornament a wall, to dealers who used them to fill empty picture frames on display, and to furniture makers who sometimes tacked them to the backs of cheap sofas and chairs after a fashion in the Vienna in those days. Hitler could also be more commercial. He often drew posters for shopkeepers, advertising such products as Teddy's perspiration powder, and there was one, perhaps turned out to make a little money at Christmas time, depicting Santa Claus selling brightly colored candles, and another showing St. Stephen's Gothic spire, which Hitler never tired of copying, rising out of a mountain of soap cakes. This was the extent of Hitler's artistic achievement, yet to the end of his life he considered himself an artist. Bohemian he certainly looked in those vagabond years in Vienna. Those who knew him then remembered later his long black shabby overcoat, which hung down to his ankles and resembled a kaftan, and which had been given him by a Hungarian Jewish old clothes dealer, a fellow inmate of the Dreary-Men's Hostel, who had befriended him. They remembered his greasy black derby, which he wore the year round, his matted hair brushed down over his forehead, as in later years, and in the back hanging dishevelled over his solid collar. For he rarely appeared to have had a haircut or a shave, and the sides of his face and his chin were usually covered with a black stubble of an incipient beard. If one can believe Hannisch, who later became something of an artist, Hitler resembled an apparition such as rarely occurs among Christians. Unlike some of the shipwrecked young men with whom he lived, he had none of the vices of youth. He neither smoked nor drank. He had nothing to do with women, not so far as can be learned because of any abnormality, but simply because of an ingrained shyness. I believe Hitler remarked after in Mein Kampf, in one of his rare flashes of humor, that those who knew me in those days took me for an eccentric. They remembered, as had his teachers, the strong, staring eyes that dominated the face and expressed something embedded in the personality that did not jibe with the miserable existence of the unwashed tramp. And they recalled that the young man, for all his laziness, when it came to physical labor, was a voracious reader, spending much of his days and evenings devouring books. At that time, I read enormously and thoroughly. All the free time my work left me was employed in my studies. In this way, I forged in a few years' time the foundations of a knowledge from which I still draw nourishment today. In Mein Kampf, Hitler discourses at length on the art of reading. By reading, to be sure, I mean perhaps something different than the average member of our so-called intelligentsia. I know people who read enormously, yet whom I would not describe as well-read. True, they possess a mass of knowledge, but their brain is unable to organize and register the material they have taken in. On the other hand, a man who possesses the art of correct reading will, instinctively and immediately perceive everything which in his opinion is worth permanently remembering, either because it is suited to his purpose or generally worth knowing. The art of reading, as of learning, is this: to retain the essential, to forget the non-essential. Footnote. The italics are Hitler's. End of footnote. Only this kind of reading has meaning and purpose. Viewed in this light, my Vienna period was especially fertile and valuable. Valuable for what? Hitler's answer is that from his reading and from his life among the poor and disinherited of Vienna, he learned all that he needed to know in later life. Vienna was and remained for me the hardest though most thorough school of my life. I had set foot in this town while still half a boy, and I left it a man, grown quiet and grave. In this period there took shape within me a world of picture and a philosophy which became the granite foundation of all my acts. In addition to what I then created, I have had to learn little, and I have had to alter nothing. What then had he learned in the school of those hard knocks which Vienna had so generously provided? What were the ideas which he acquired there from his reading and his experience, and which, as he says, would remain essentially unaltered to the end? That they were mostly shallow and shabby, often grotesque and preposterous and poisoned by outlandish prejudices, will become obvious on the most cursory examination. That they are important to this history, as they were to the world, is equally obvious, for they were to form part of the foundation for the Third Reich, which this bookish vagrant was soon to build. The budding ideas of Adolf Hitler. They were, with one exception, not original, but picked up raw from the churning maelstrom of Austrian politics and life in the first years of the 20th century. The Danube monarchy was dying of indigestion. For centuries, a minority of German-Austrian had ruled over the polyglot empire of a dozen nationalities and stamped their language and their culture on it. But since 1848, their hold had been weakening. The minorities could not be digested. Austria was not a melting pot. In the 1860s, the Italians had broken away, and in 1867, the Hungarians had won equality with the Germans under a so-called dual monarchy. Now, as the 20th century began, the various Slav peoples, the Czechs and Slovaks, the Serbs, the Croats, and the others, were demanding equality and at least national autonomy. Austrian politics had become dominated by the bitter quarrel of the nationalities. But this was not all. There was social revolt too, and this often transcended the racial struggle. The disenfranchised lower classes were demanding the ballot, and the workers were insisting on the right to organize trade unions and to strike, not only for higher wages and better working conditions, but to gain their democratic political ends. Indeed, a general strike had finally brought universal manhood suffrage, and with this the end of political dominance by the Austrian Germans, who numbered but a third of the population of the Austrian half of the empire. To these developments, Hitler, the fanatical young German-Austrian nationalist from Linz, was bitterly opposed. To him, the empire was sinking into a foul morass. It could be saved only if the master race, the Germans, reasserted their old absolute authority. The non-German races, especially the Slavs and above all the Czechs, were an inferior people. It was up to the Germans to rule them with an iron hand. The parliament must be abolished, and an end put to all the democratic nonsense. Though he took no part in politics, Hitler followed avidly the activities of the three major political parties of Old Austria: the Social Democrats, the Christian Socialist, and the Pan-German Nationalist. And there now began to sprout in the mind of this unkempt frequenter of the soup kitchens a political shrewdness which enabled him to see with amazing clarity the strengths and weaknesses of contemporary political movements, and which, as it matured, would make him the master politician of Germany. At first contact he developed developed a furious hatred for the party of the Social Democrats. What most repelled me, he says, was its hostile attitude toward the struggle for the preservation of Germanism, and its disgraceful courting of the Slavic comrade. In a few months I obtained what might have otherwise required decades of an understanding of a pestilential horror. Footnote. The word was cut out in the second and all subsequent editions of Mein Kampf, and the noun pestilence substituted. End of footnote. Cloaking herself as social virtue and brotherly love. And yet he was already intelligent enough to quench his feelings of rage against this party of the working class, in order to examine carefully the reasons for its popular success. He concluded that there were several reasons, and years later he was to remember them and utilize them in building up the National Socialist Party of Germany. One day, he recounts in Mein Kampf, he witnessed a mass demonstration of Viennese workers. For nearly 2 hours I stood there watching with bated breath the gigantic human dragon slowly winding by. In oppressed anxiety, I finally left the place and sauntered homeward. At home, he began to read the Social Democratic press, examine the speeches of its leaders, study its organization, reflect on its psychology and political techniques, and ponder the results. He came to 3 conclusions, which explained to him the success of the Social Democrats. They knew how to create a mass movement, without which any political party was useless. They had learned the art of propaganda among the masses. And finally, they knew the value of using what he calls spiritual and physical terror. This 3rd lesson, though it was surely based on faulty observation and compounded of his own immense prejudices, intrigued the young Hitler. Within 10 years, he would put it to good use for his own ends. I understood the infamous spiritual terror which this movement exerts, particularly on the bourgeoisie, which is neither morally nor mentally equal to such attacks. At a given sign, it unleashes a veritable barrage of lies and slanders against whatever adversary seems most dangerous, until the nerves of the attacked persons break down. This is a tactic based on precise calculation of all human weaknesses, and its result will lead to success with almost mathematical certainty. I achieved an equal understanding of the importance of physical terror toward the individual and the masses, for while in the ranks of their supporters the victory achieved seems a triumph of the justice of their own cause, the defeated adversary in most cases, despairs of the success of any further resistance. No more precise analysis of Nazi tactics, as Hitler was eventually to develop them, was ever written. There were 2 political parties which strongly attracted the fledgling Hitler in Vienna, and to both of them he applied his growing power of shrewd, cold analysis. His first allegiance, he says, was to the Pan-German Nationalist Party, founded by George Ritter von Schönener. Oh my God. Fucking names. Anyway, who came from the same region near Spittal in Lower Austria as had Hitler's family. The Pan-Germans at the time were engaged in a last-ditch struggle for German supremacy in the multinational empire, and though Hitler thought that Schauner was a profound thinker. You know what? You pronounce it yourself. It's spelled Schoenerer. Okay? And enthusiastically embraced his basic program of violent nationalism, anti-Semitism, anti-socialism, union with Germany, and opposition to the Habsburgs and the Holy See. He quickly sized up the causes for the party's failure. The Holy See, S-E-E, what? This movement inadequate appreciation of the importance of the social problem cost it the truly militant mass of the people. Its entry into Parliament took away its mighty impetus and burdened it with all the weaknesses peculiar to this institution. The struggle against the Catholic Church robbed it of countless of the best elements that the nation can call its own. Though Hitler was to forget it when he came to power in Germany, one of the lessons of his Vienna years, which he stresses at great length in Mein Kampf, is the futility of a political party's trying to oppose the churches. Regardless of how much room for criticism there was in any religious denomination, he says, in explaining why Schaunerer's Los von Rom, away from Rome movement was a tactical error. A political party must never, for a moment, lose sight of the fact that in all previous historical experience, a purely political party has never succeeded in producing a religious reformation. But it was the failure of the Pan-Germans to arouse the masses, their inability to even understand the psychology of the common people, that to Hitler constituted their biggest mistake. It is obvious from his recapitulation of the ideas that began to form in his mind when he was not much past the age of 21, that to him this was the cardinal error. He was not to repeat it when he founded his own political movement. There was another mistake of the Pan-Germans, which Hitler was not to make. That was the failure to win over the support of at least some of the powerful, established institutions of the nation, if not the church, then the army, say, or the cabinet, or the head of state. Unless a political movement gained such backing, the young man saw it would be difficult, if not impossible, for it to assume power. This support was precisely what Hitler had the shrewdness to arrange for in the crucial January days of 1933 in Berlin, and what alone made it possible for him and his National Socialist Party to take over the rule of a great nation. There was one political leader in Vienna in Hitler's time who understood this, as well as the necessity of building a party on the foundation of the masses. This was Dr. Karl Lueger, the Burgomaster of Vienna and leader of the Christian Social Party, who more than any other became Hitler's political mentor, though the two never met. Hitler always regarded him as the greatest German mayor of all times, a statesman greater than all the so-called diplomats of the time. If Dr. Karl Lueger had lived in Germany, he would have been ranked among the great minds of our people. There was, to be sure, little resemblance between Hitler, as he later became, and this big, bluff, genial idol of the Viennese lower middle classes. It is true that Lueger became the most powerful politician in Austria as the head of the party which was drawn from the disgruntled petty bourgeoisie and which made political capital, as Hitler later did, out of the raucous anti-Semitism. But Luger, who had risen from modest circumstances and worked his way through the university, was a man of considerable intellectual attainments, and his opponents, including the Jews, readily conceded that he was at heart a decent, chivalrous, generous, and tolerant man. Stefan Zweig, the eminent Austrian Jewish writer, who was growing up in Vienna at this time, has testified that Luger never allowed his official anti-Semitism to stop him from being helpful and friendly to the Jews. His city administration, Zweig recounted, was perfectly just and even typically democratic. The Jews who had trembled at this triumph of the anti-Semitic party continued to live with the same rights and esteem as always. This the young Hitler did not like. He thought Luger was far too tolerant and did not appreciate the racial problem of the Jews. He resented the mayor's failure to embrace pan-Germanism and was skeptical of his Roman Catholic clericalism and his loyalty to the Habsburgs. Had not the old emperor Franz Joseph twice refused to sanction Luger's election as burgomaster? But in the end, Hitler was forced to acknowledge the genius of this man, who knew how to win the support of the masses, who understood modern social problems and the importance of propaganda and oratory in swaying the multitude. Hitler could not help but admire the way Luger dealt with the powerful church. His policy was fashioned with infinite shrewdness, and finally, Luger was quick to make use of all available means for winning the support of long-established institutions, so as to be able to derive the greatest possible advantage for his movement from those old sources of power. Here, in a nutshell, were the ideas and techniques which Hitler was later to use in constructing his own political party and in leading it to power in Germany. His originality lay in his being the only politician of the right to apply them to German scene after the First World War. It was then that the Nazi movement alone among the nationalist and conservative parties gained a great mass following, and having achieved this, won over the support of the army, the President of the Republic, and the associations of big business. 3. Long-established institutions of great power which led to the Chancellorship of Germany. The lessons learned in Vienna proved useful indeed. Dr. Karl Lueger had been a brilliant orator, but the Pan-German party had lacked effective public speakers. Hitler took notice of this, and in Mein Kampf makes much of the importance of oratory in politics. The power which has always started the greatest religious and political avalanches in history rolling has from time to immemorial been the magic power of the spoken word, and that alone. The broad masses of the people can be moved only by the power of speech. All great movements are popular movements, volcanic eruptions of human passions and emotional sentiments stirred either by the cruel goddess of distress or by the firebrand of the word hurled among the masses. They are not the lemonade-like outpourings of the literary aesthetes and drawing-room heroes. Though refraining from actual participation in Austrian party politics, young Hitler already was beginning to practice his oratory on the audiences which he found in Vienna's flop houses, soup kitchens, and on its street corners. It was to develop into a talent, as his author, who later was to listen to scores of his most important speeches, can testify, more formidable than any other in the Germany between the wars, and it was to contribute in a large measure to his astounding success. And finally, in Hitler's Vienna experience, there were the Jews. In Linz, he says, there had been a few Jews. At home, I do not remember having heard the word during my father's lifetime. At high school, there was a Jewish boy, but we didn't give the matter any thought. I even took them, the Jews, for Germans. According to Hitler's boyhood friend, this is not the truth. When I first met Adolf Hitler, says August Kubizek, recalling their days together in Linz, his anti-Semitism was already pronounced. Hitler was already a confirmed anti-Semite when he went to Vienna. And although his experiences in Vienna might have deepened his feeling, they certainly did not give birth to it. Then, says Hitler, I came to Vienna. Preoccupied by the abundance of my impressions, oppressed by the hardship of my own lot, I gained at first no insight into the inner stratification of the people in this gigantic city. Notwithstanding that Vienna in those days counted nearly 200,000 Jews among its 2 million inhabitants, I did not see them. The Jew was still characterized for me by nothing but his religion, and therefore, on grounds of human tolerance, I maintained my rejection of religious attacks in this case as in others. Consequently, the tone of the Viennese anti-Semitic press seemed to me unworthy of the cultural tradition of a great nation. One day, Hitler recounts, he went strolling through the inner city. I suddenly encountered an apparition in a black kaftan and black sidelocks. Is this a Jew? Was my first thought. For, to be sure, they had not looked like that in Linz. I observed the man furtively and cautiously, but the longer I stared at his foreign face, scrutinizing feature for feature, the more my first question assumed a new form. Is this a German? Hitler's answer may be readily guessed. He claims, though, that before answering he decided to try to relieve my doubts by books. He buried himself in anti-Semitic literature, which had a large sale in Vienna at the time. Then he took to the streets to observe the phenomenon more closely. Wherever I went, he says, I began to see Jews, and the more I saw, the more sharply they became distinguished in my eyes from the rest of humanity. Later, I often grew sick to the stomach from the smell of these kaftan wearers. Next, he says, he discovered the moral stain on his chosen people. Was there any form of filth or profligacy, particularly in cultural life, even cautiously into such an abscesses you found like a maggot in a rotting body, often dazzled by the sudden light, a kike. The Jews were largely responsible, he says, he found, for prostitution and the white slave traffic. When for the first time, he relates, I recognized the Jew as the cold-hearted, shameless, and calculating director of this revolting vice traffic in the scum of the big city. A cold shudder ran down my back. There is a great deal of morbid sexuality in Hitler's ravings about the Jews. This was characteristic of Vienna's anti-Semitic press of the time, as it later was to be of the obscene Nuremberg weekly Der Stürmer, published by one of Hitler's favorite cronies, Julius Streicher, Nazi boss of Franconia, a noted pervert and one of the most unsavory characters in the Third Reich. Mein Kampf is sprinkled with lurid allusions to uncouth Jews seducing innocent Christian girls and thus adulterating their blood. Hitler can write of the nightmare vision of the seduction of hundreds of thousands of girls by repulsive, crooked-legged Jew bastards. As Rudolf Olden has pointed out, one of the roots of Hitler's anti-Semitism may have been his tortured sexual envy. Though he was in his early 20s, so far as is known, he had no relations of any kind with women during his sojourn in Vienna. Gradually, Hitler relates, "I began to hate them. For me, this was the time of the greatest spiritual upheaval I have ever had to go through. I had ceased to be a weak-kneed cosmopolitan and became an anti-Semite. He was to remain a blind and fanatical one to the bitter end. His last testament, written a few hours before his death, would contain a final blast against the Jews as responsible for the war which he had started and which was now finishing him and the Third Reich. This burning hatred, which was to infect so many Germans in that empire, would lead ultimately to a massacre so horrible and on such a scale as to leave an ugly scar on civilization that will surely last as long as man on earth." In the spring of 1913, Hitler left Vienna for good and went to live in Germany, where his heart, he says, had always been. He was 24, and to everyone except himself, he must have seemed a total failure. He had not become a painter, nor an architect. He had become nothing, so far as anyone could see, but a vagabond, an egocentric, bookish one to be sure. He had no friends, no family, no job, no home. He had, however, one thing, an unquenchable confidence in himself and a deep, burning sense of mission. Probably, he left Austria to escape military service. Footnote. Since 1910, when he was 21, he had been subject to military service. According to Haydn, the Austrian authorities could not put their finger on him while he was in Vienna. They finally located him in Munich and ordered him to report for examination in Linz. Joseph Graener, in his Das Ende des Huller Mythos, publishes some of the correspondence between Hitler and the Austrian military authorities, in which Hitler denies that he went to Germany to avoid Austrian military service. On the ground that he lacked funds, he requested to be allowed to take his examination in Salzburg because of its nearness to Munich. He was examined there in February the 5th, 1914, and found unfit for military or even auxiliary service on account of poor health. Apparently, he still had a lung ailment. His failure to report for military service until the authorities finally located him at the age of 24 must have bothered Hitler when his star rose in Germany. Graener confirms a story that was current in anti-Nazi circles when I was in Berlin, that when the German troops occupied Austria in 1938, Hitler ordered the Gestapo to find the official papers relating to his military service. The records in Linz were searching in vain. To Hitler's mounting fury, they had been removed by a member of the local government, who, after the war, showed them to greener. End of footnote. This was not because he was a coward, but because he loathed the idea of serving in the ranks with Jews, Slavs, and other minority races of the empire. In Mein Kampf, Hitler states that he went to Munich in the spring of 1912, but this is an error. A police register lists him as living in Vienna until May 1913. His own stated reasons for leaving Austria are quite grandiose. My inner revulsion toward the Habsburg state steadily grew. I was repelled by the conglomeration of races which the capital showed me, repelled by the whole mixture of Czechs, Poles, Hungarians, Ruthenians, Serbs, and Croats, and everywhere the eternal mushroom of humanity, Jews and more Jews. To me, the giant city seemed the embodiment of racial discretion. The longer I lived in this city, the more my hatred grew for the foreign mixture of peoples which had begun to corrode the old site of German culture. For all these reasons, a longing rose stronger and stronger in me to go at last whither since my childhood secret desires and secret love had drawn me. His destiny in that land he loved so dearly was to be such as not even he, in his wildest dreams, could have then imagined. He was, and would remain until shortly before he became Chancellor, technically a foreigner and Austrian in the German Reich. It is only as an Austrian who came of age in the last decade before the collapse of the Habsburg Empire, who failed to take root in its civilized capital, who embraced all the preposterous prejudices and hates then rife among its German-speaking extremists, and who failed to grasp what was decent and honest and honorable in the vast majority of his fellow citizens, were they Czechs or Jews or Germans, poor or well off, artists or artisans, that Hitler can be understood. It is doubtful if any German from the north, from the Rhineland, in the west, from East Prussia, or even from Bavaria in the south, could have had in his blood and mind, out of any possible experience, exactly the mixture of ingredients which propelled Adolf Hitler to the heights he eventually reached. To be sure, there was added a liberal touch of unpredictable genius. But in the spring of 1913, his genius had not yet shone. In Munich, as in Vienna, he remained penniless, friendless, and without a regular job. And then, in the summer of 1914, the war came, snatching him, like millions of others, into its grim clutches. On August the 3rd, he petitioned King Ludwig III of Bavaria for permission to volunteer in a Bavarian regiment, and it was granted. This was the heaven-sent opportunity. Now the young vagabond could satisfy not only his passion to serve his beloved adopted country in what he says he believed was a fight for its existence, to be or not to be, but he could escape from all the failures and frustrations of his personal life. To me, he wrote in Mein Kampf, those hours came as a deliverance from the distress that had weighed upon me during the days of my youth. I am not ashamed to say that, carried away by the enthusiasm of the moment, I sank down on my knees and thanked heaven out of the fullness of my heart for granting me the good fortune of being permitted to live in such a time. For me, as for every German, there now began the most memorable period of my life. Compared to the events of the gigantic struggle, all the past fell away into oblivion. For Hitler, the past, with all its shabbiness, loneliness, and disappointments, was to remain in the shadows, though it shaped his mind and character forever afterward. The war, which now would bring death to so many millions, brought for him, at 25, a new start in life.